Many people think that brown eyes are dominant to blue eyes, and that's the end of the story. But in reality, it's not as simple as that. Most traits are actually quite complex. They are not due to just one gene controlling one trait. In this video, we're going to take a look at complex inheritance patterns that explain how most traits work. Here's an example for our first pattern. It is possible for two people with a dark skin phenotype to have a child that has a lighter skin phenotype. And here's why. If we looked at the genotype of two parents with darker skin, we would see that there are multiple genes working together to produce the color of the skin. And so this parent, half of their alleles are dark and dominant, half of the alleles code for light skin, the recessive trait. Same thing with the other parent. Now, if we produce the gametes, the egg and the sperm from these parents, we would get a gigantic Punnett square that shows that there are a ton of possible phenotypes for skin color. In fact, if we analyzed it, we would see that there is a 1 in 64 chance that a child could have all of the recessive light-skinned alleles. Similarly, there's a 1 in 64 chance that a child could have all of the dominant darker skin alleles. And then there's a higher probability that children would have an intermediate phenotype. And in fact, this is a simplification of how skin color works. Scientists believe that there are actually more than 3 genes working together. But this is an example of a polygenic trait, where more than one gene, or pair of alleles, is responsible for one phenotype. And this explains not just skin color, but also height. Height is due to multiple alleles. The dominant allele makes you taller and the recessive allele makes you shorter. So depending on how many dominant and recessive alleles you get from your two parents, you can end up shorter, the same height, or taller than your parents. Our second pattern, here's an example. If this red flower is crossed with a white flower, we get a pink flower. Why does that happen? Well, incomplete dominance is at work. With incomplete dominance, the two extreme phenotypes are the homozygous genotypes. So homozygous dominant is red and homozygous recessive is white. If those are crossed to get a heterozygous genotype, the phenotype is intermediate. The pink color is in between the phenotype of red and white. If we were to take these pink flowers and cross them in a monohybrid cross, we would get a 1 to 2 to 1 genotype and phenotype ratio, because only the homozygous dominant would be red and only the homozygous recessive would be white, and the two heterozygotes would be in between pink color. Here's an example of our third pattern. Here we have two black mice being crossed, and we get some offspring that are black, some that are brown, and some that are white. Now you might think, oh, this is incomplete dominance again, because I have 3 phenotypes and one is in between the other 2. But if you think about it more carefully, you'll see that that explanation does not work. If this were incomplete dominance, these two parents would be homozygous dominant, and thus the only possible offspring they could have is another homozygous dominant black mouse. But instead we're getting all 3 possibilities. So what's the explanation? Well, here's what's going on. There are actually 2 genes working together to produce that fur color. But this is a little bit more complex than just a polygenic trait, though it is an example of a polygenic trait. What's happening is that there's a B gene that determines the type of color, whether it's black or brown. But then there's a C gene that turns on the B gene. So let's say that a mouse has a dominant B. Well, it should be black, except if it has 2 recessive Cs. 2 recessive Cs turn off the color gene, and so the mice ends up white. Similarly, if the mouse has 2 recessive Bs, then it's going to end up brown, the recessive color, except if it also has 2 recessive Cs. Those 2 recessive Cs are going to turn off the recessive Bs, and the mouse will also end up white. And in this case, we get a funky ratio, a 9:3:4 ratio. This ratio is often evidence of something called epistasis. And to use an analogy to think of this, consider the trait of a light bulb's color. Here's a nice, pretty yellow light bulb. To have that yellow light bulb, though, we really need two things. You need a yellow light bulb that works, but then you need an on switch for the light bulb. So in this case, the light bulb is just fine, but the switch is off, so we don't get a yellow light. In this case, the switch is on, but the yellow light is broken, and so we don't get the yellow light. So in a nutshell, with epistasis, one gene is controlling a second gene, and together that results in one trait. And we often see this in the case of color, type of color versus production of color. And as mentioned, epistasis is an example of polygenic inheritance because we've got two different genes working together for one trait. And if you're trying to recognize this in a case study, one tip is to see a strange ratio for a one-trait cross, like 9:3:4. That suggests that there's something more complicated than just one gene going on. Pattern number 4. Here's an example. There's a disease called LHON that results in a loss of vision in one or both eyes. So this is what you would see if you had this disease. Now, if we look at the inheritance for this disease in a pedigree, here's what the pattern would look like. All the shaded individuals have the disease. If you look carefully, you'll notice that anytime a mother has the disease, all of her children get the disease. But if the father has the disease, none of the children get the disease. Why is that? It's not just sex linkage. It actually has to do with extranuclear inheritance. Usually when we talk about DNA, we're talking about the chromosomes in the nucleus. But remember that mitochondria and chloroplasts have their own little loops of DNA. And those loops of DNA can determine a few of your traits. So in the example we just saw, that trait was due to mitochondrial DNA, which is abbreviated mtDNA. And the reason why the mother was giving the trait to all her children is that during fertilization, it's the egg that provides the organelles to the zygote. The sperm only provides the chromosomes. So a mitochondrial trait is always inherited from the mother. Our final inheritance pattern explains why these two siblings, who are identical twins with identical DNA, have slightly different phenotypes. The reason is that the environment can influence how genes are expressed. Triggers in the environment like light, temperature, and chemicals can turn on and off genes, thus changing how genes are expressed as proteins, and thus how proteins become phenotypes. And that concludes our exploration of complex inheritance patterns.